Hi, and welcome to this Fane online event with the brilliant Lottie Mills, whose new short story collection, Monstrum, I have been reading and have just been quite blown away by. And I'm not alone there. You have some incredible blurb quotes. You've got A.S. Bayat here saying Lottie's writing is a superb flight of the imagination. You've got Jan Carson, who calls it haunting and magical. Um, and Welcome, Lottie. I'm so pleased to be talking to you today
Lovely to be speaking
about
to you
these
too.
stories, which are just so absolutely my kind of thing. And characteristically, perhaps the bloodthirstier ones were my favorite, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So kind of firstly, how are you feeling about publication? Are you excited?
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's a bit, I mean, you'll know, it's a bit surreal that the lead up has kind of been so long, and now it suddenly all feels like it's happening at once. It's a bit strange to think that the book's actually going to be out there in the world. Like some of my friends have been reading it now, and obviously reviewers and other authors and things. So it's very strange to have people finally talking to me about my stories and finally understanding what I'm on about. But yeah, it's really exciting.
Kind of related to that. This is something some writers I know are sharing work in progress kind of throughout the process. But I'm sort of like very much on the other, I'm like I feel like I'm quite a private writer when I'm actually working on something. I don't even like talking about it particularly. And sort of where do you stand on that spectrum? Has this been quite a sort of private thing or
It's interesting. I do have people that I share stuff with as I'm going, but what's quite nice about a short story collection is even when the book was in progress, whenever I gave something to someone, it was normally a finished story. So that was kind of like a nice halfway house, I guess, in that I probably wouldn't normally show someone like a half finished story unless I was really stuck on it. Um, but yeah, it's sort of, I definitely did show some people bits of stuff as I was going. Um, it depended on the individual story as well. Like some of them were quite a messy process to write, and kind of it took a long time for them to get to a state I was happy with. And those ones I didn't show to anyone. I was kind of quite kept those quiet until they were ready. So yeah, it's a real mix, I think, especially with short stories.
Lottie, perhaps you could like tell us a bit about Monstrum and the short stories within it. Kind of in your own words. What were you doing here?
Yeah.
What are you doing here?
So, so Monstrum is, as you say, it's a collection of 10 short stories. Um, and they're quite, a lot of them are quite different from each other. I would say that there are a lot, a lot of different sort of genres in there sometimes. But broadly speaking, they all look at ideas of difference or kind of outsiderness in some sense. And they all kind of use slightly supernatural or kind of eerie frameworks of things like folk horror. There's a little bit of like speculative type stuff in there. Um, yeah, a lot of Gothic elements in there as well. And they use those kind of fairy tale or folk tale aspects in order to unpack the way that people feel about difference and about disability, and to kind of almost challenge those narratives and hopefully kind of reclaim them sometimes as a way to celebrate that difference, and kind of make it quite a powerful thing rather than like a disempowering thing as it has been in the past.
Yeah, what does a day in your writing life look like? This is another question I'm kind of just very nosily curious
Yeah.
about. Am I normal? Am I normal,
I
Lottie?
love I love those like articles where they show like famous writers' routines and stuff, but they also do kind of make me kind of ashamed because I'm very, I would say I'm very chaotic in the way I work, and like I it's very I'm very it's there's no regular day, if you know what I mean. Some people are obviously really regimented and have great discipline and write from this hour to this hour. I'm not like that usually, and I can pin some of that on kind of disability and stuff. I have good health days and bad health days, and that influences. But I also do just think it's a personality thing as well. The interesting thing for me is I do tend to write almost exclusively at night. So I'm not because I'm a complete night owl, not a morning person at all. So particularly when I was writing Monstrum, some of that was when I was at university, and I would do my day, and hang out with my friends and do my uni work and whatever, and then around we were very lucky at the college I was at, Newnham. We had a beautiful, quite old, spooky Victorian library. And around 10 p.m., I would head off to the library on my own, normally in my pajamas, and then just sit there and write until the library closed, which was at about 2 in the morning. So I think I don't know what it is, something about the kind of privacy of nighttime and of being on your own, and just for some reason that's when my brain wakes up. So yeah, normally when I was writing Monstrum, I kept very unsociable hours a lot of the time and was writing
Mm,
late into the night and then sleeping late into the morning, which I don't really recommend from a social perspective, but it was useful for writing for sure. But yeah,
mm,
and I'm very much a stop-start person, so sometimes I have kind of, again, I think this is quite a typical writer thing, maybe, if there is such a thing as a typical writer, but
mhm.
I have periods where I'm kind of really captured by an idea and I'm writing a lot for hours and hours and it just feels like it's flowing. Um, and other times, yeah, it's just I don't look like I'm doing a whole lot, to be honest.
Yeah, the knocking your head into a brick wall phase of writing. That's really interesting because I can really personally relate to sort of the idea of the privacy,
Mm,
sort of even a sort of psychological privacy being quite important
yeah.
to the process of writing. I'm also a night owl, but I can only ever work. It's like I only ever write in the morning, and I only
Interesting.
ever write for a couple of hours. But it's like I need to get to that part of my brain before kind of the day scabs the prefrontal cortex
Yeah.
over with other things. Like I need to be in that sort of vulnerable and squishy state of still being half asleep. So perhaps that applies at sort of either end
Yeah.
of the day. Oh, I like the image of you writing these stories in a Victorian library. That feels very, very apposite somehow.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to ask you, this is something I think writing short stories is the chicest possible thing. And I have never been able to do it, and I would love to be able to do it. And it's something I'm very much intending to kind of knock my head against in the future until something finally happens, because I love reading short stories. I'm a huge reader of short story collections, but it's never actually something I've attempted myself. So
Mm,
I'm interested in sort of the curatorial and sort of editorial sides of putting a collection of short stories together and how that works for you. Because obviously it's quite different from editing a novel, I would assume. There's sort of these questions of flow
mm,
and kind of, well, what's the centerpiece of the collection? How do they relate to each other thematically? Was
yeah.
there anything you cut or added sort of last minute? Sort of, I know you know, friends and other writers I know who've written short story collections, sometimes there's this kind of last minute, we need another one,
Yeah.
or is, you know, does this one stand up to the others? So what was that process like for you?
Yeah, it's one of the aspects I found kind of most surprising in a way, or most interesting. It was kind of, I naturally, like in myself, in terms of my writing style, I'm not a very good editor. So that was a part of the process I was very apprehensive about going into. Like I'm a huge, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge champion of like the necessity of good and quite harsh editing. But it's something I struggle with myself. I think it's because I'm very much, oh, hello.
Sorry, my cat. And now he's gone. Sorry.
That's delightful, don't worry. Yeah, I think it's very much because when I write, I'm very much perfectionist while I'm writing, and I do a lot of editing as I go. And so by the time it's done, I'm like, well, it's done now. I don't, so part of me is like, I don't want to look at it again. So it was a part of the process I knew was going to be interesting for me. In terms of kind of curating the way the stories were, I did it in a slightly unusual, almost kind of backwards way, in that I did the changeling. Hello. Sorry, I've got to ask, what's the cat's name?
Oh, that's Sam. I've got two, brother and
Oh,
sister.
lovely.
And he, if I'm doing something, he wants to do it as well, which is very, very sweet, but quite annoying. Yeah, go behind. That's good. That's good. Sorry. I
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm very easily distracted.
There we
Um,
go.
yeah, so in terms of, I did it almost slightly backwards. In terms of, I obviously did the Changeling for the BBC Young Writers Award, and then
Oh.
that won and was on the radio, and that was amazing. And then my agent contacted me on the basis of that story, and so I was a very lucky position to be in a way, in that I hadn't like submitted a book, so the book didn't really exist before
Yeah.
my agent came into the picture and said, have you considered writing more of these, putting them together in a collection? And so, in that sense, I had this kind of wonderful support of someone who knew what they were talking about and how collections should be shaped and all of those sorts of things. Helping me kind of build this and put it together around the Changeling. So that was obviously the first one, even though it's such a short little one at the beginning there. Um,
Mm.
and then, yeah, there wasn't like a last minute, we need a new story, but one of the things that did happen kind of when I was in the process of editing was that one of the stories, the White Lion was always in the collection, but it was a completely different story.
Interesting.
So the only thing that was kind of similar about it was it still had a Victorian setting and it had a white lion in it. But
Mm.
the entire gist of the story was completely different. The characters were different. And when I was doing my edits, it was a sticking point. The sort of the publishing house could kind of take it or leave it, and they were like, "Yeah, it's fine." But it was a sticking point for me. I was like, "That is the one that I'm not happy with. It's not
Interesting.
working." So I completely rewrote it during edits into the story that's in the collection. And then there was some, so like the body. Um, that one was the process of kind of writing it. I think because it's so personal. I sort of wrote it in this massive like stream of consciousness flow, which meant that it was a monstrous thing. We had to cut out more than 2,000 words, I think. I think it was like
Wow.
2,500 words had to be cut from that because it came from such a kind of personal place in a way that I
Mm.
just like, while I was writing it, I was just kind of going, yeah, throwing everything in and not being my kind of usual disciplined self, I guess, in terms of editing as I went, because I knew I couldn't censor myself in some way while writing that. And then we had to kind of cut it out of the mess and make it into something visible. Um,
That's interesting. Yeah. Because I think one of the reasons I love the body so I mean it's such a searing uh piece of work, and as you say, kind of intensely personal for you in its themes, but it felt for me that it did stand apart stylistically from kind of the rest of the collection in a way that was really stark and I thought really powerful. It's sort of like the reflected blaze of the body kind of bounces off the stories around it as well.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and interestingly, I think the White Lion was probably my next favorite. I loved the White Lion. I thought it was fabulous.
I
So,
find it I find it really interesting that those are the two you picked because those are chronologically those are the last two that I wrote. And one of the
hmm,
things that I noticed, like you say, when I was putting the book together originally, when I kind of submitted it to my publisher and was like, "Yeah, it's done. This is the finished draft." I submitted it with the stories just in chronological order of how
yeah.
I'd written them because that's how I'd literally assembled the manuscript and the kind of mechanics of putting it together. Basically quite lazy, really. I just had this one big document and I would write the story and then I'd copy and paste the story in. It was kind of, and so it was that version of it still exists. And what I found interesting was that I was 18, 17 or 18 when I started kind of working on the collection and nearly 22 by the time I finished. And
Mm.
I could read through and I could see, and I think that got smoothed off in the edit because obviously I reworked things and I changed things and it's all kind of more uniform because of that, which is good. But that original version was quite interesting to read because I could see the evolution of how I was writing. And one of the things that I was very conscious of because we were choosing the order the stories were going to be in right up until the end. I was very indecisive about it. We had a lot
Mm.
of discussions, a lot of literally physically listing them out and putting them in different
Yeah.
orders and going, well, I don't want that one next to that one. And, I got quite stressed about it. And one of the things that I was kind of using as a factor to make that decision was, almost like my slightly earlier work versus the ones that were later, because I think you're right that something like The Body, which was the last one I wrote, um, does have a different quality to it. And I think there are good and bad things about both of those different styles, but it is interesting.
Yeah, this kind of brings me somewhat onto the next question I was going to ask you, but I think it's an interesting one because I'm at the stage now where like I've written my second novel, and I've had people sort of say to me, like including, my dad and my partner, and kind of like, oh, don't take this the wrong way, but I think this is better than the Manning Tree Witches. Like I'm going to be really offended, and it's like, but no, I want to be getting better. Like, what, sort of what's the point of this if I don't feel, when I'm sitting down to write several years later, okay, I know what I'm doing now, kind
Yeah.
of, I've got this on lockdown. I think it can be quite gratifying, um, being able to see kind of, my thematic interests are broadening and the way I'm able to handle material is getting like more sophisticated and all those sorts of things. But I suppose there is another side to it as well, which is you are really young. You are so young to be publishing a full collection of short stories. And I also started publishing quite young poetry rather than prose. Um, and I think there can be, and like you, obviously it's an enormous achievement, but I think there can also be a sort of equivocal feeling of like, oh my God, what if in 5 years' time I absolutely hate all of this and it's out there in the world forever?
Mm.
And I don't think I've ever felt quite as bad as all that about sort of my early poems, but I do sometimes have this like, oh, my juvenilia sort of. So are those anxieties that are sort of working in your mind at all, or?
Yeah, it's I feel like I've been through quite a journey with this because I think like you, it's something I've thought about a lot. And I think weirdly I already again like you, I did sort of bits and bobs that were not published in this sense, but that were
Mm,
in competitions and that, and that were sort of out there and that I can still look at now when I was about 16 or whatever, when I was a teenager. And I already know that I have that experience of looking back and going, oh, I would,
me.
I would recognize that person. I wouldn't write like that quite now.
Mm,
But and when the book was very, very new and it was kind of on submission, a lot of the feedback we were getting from editors, some of whom who meant it in a good way and some of whom meant it in a bad way, which was interesting, was that it was very young, as in that, you could tell it was written by a young person, which I sort of didn't always know how to take. And I think I had to, and like I say, even within the course of writing it, I noticed that when I looked back on something I hadn't read for a while that I wrote earlier on in the process, it would, you know, it would feel quite strange sometimes, or there would be things that were stylistically different to how I had sort of developed as a writer. Particularly because I did university during the course of writing. So even things like honing my academic writing, having such rigorous practice with that, I think made me change some of my habits. Um,
mm,
but I think the place I kind of eventually got to was almost like I'm quite now sort of almost proud of the fact that I think maybe I will look back and go, wow, that was really like a time capsule of how I felt in a moment in time. I think Zadie Smith had this great quote where she said that she looks back at White Teeth and she doesn't recognize the person that wrote that, who was also, I think, 22 or whatever.
mm.
Um, and but that's not necessarily a bad thing because I think there are things that I'll have when I'm a bit older as a writer that I don't have now that will really enrich my writing. But there are also possibly things I have now or had as an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old that I think particularly a kind of like almost like an earnestness or a like I have this thing to say and I'm going to say it. Um, and that are a quality of their own that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think sometimes people are a bit wary of that, but I think actually that's a way that people feel, and I think it's nice to have that represented and to have particularly young readers be able to recognize something sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call it passionate because that sounds a bit, self, but something kind of quite raw and quite young. Um, I think that's almost good to preserve that. And yeah, so I think even if it does make me cringe in some ways, I think also it's a valid style of its own as the place I've come to. And in years to come, or maybe I'll look back in years to come and still like it and still be proud of it. But I just don't know, obviously. So
Yeah.
yeah, it will be interesting to see how that pans out long term.
Yeah, I think you're totally right to make the point that sometimes there can be that sort of element of impassionedness or earnestness to the writing of a young person. It's sort of that the level of sort of moderation you perhaps learn as you get a bit older in all aspects of your life, sort of your interpersonal relationships, but also your art, like certainly I feel like now I've been through publication a couple of times, I find it much more difficult to shut down the imaginary Goodreads reader on my shoulder.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, when you think of kind of, I don't know, the passion of the young Rambo, like as a poet or something like that, and lots of critics have made the point of could an older person have written poetry like he did? Possibly not, or Keats or someone. Um, that there is a specificity to what's going on there that is very, very worthwhile. Um, Interesting. I
I
wonder.
also I also very much this whole process, um I'm sorry. Um, I also very much came at this whole process from the standpoint, and I think this is very much a first time kind of author thing,
Mhm.
the standpoint of, well, this might never happen to me again.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely lends something to, and I think that's something that some people do preserve into a second or third, it's that kind of not taking anything for granted mentality of like, well, I might never have this opportunity again to kind of share the things I want to share. And so I think, particularly with it being a short story collection, I think you can do this even more of there's a real feeling in the book, I think, of me having wanted to put as much in there as I can without it becoming totally chaotic. But sort of trying to contain all of the things I want to say, because I think you really can feel that in sort of particularly people's early writing of like, well, I might not have this chance. It's almost just like kind of desperation in that sense, which, yeah, I think is another kind of element of that people can feel.
Well, I very much hope, as a new fan, that the world gets so much more of your work in the future, and I'm
Thank
sure it
you.
will,
I hope
if
so.
this is anything to go by. I wanted to kind of dive a bit more into the themes of the collection
Yeah.
at the moment, because you draw on elements of the grotesque, elements of the Gothic, elements of historical writing in places, as you say, kind of the White Lion is this almost pseudo-Victorian world that we see these kind of burnished glimpses of. And I guess the first question I asked, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot myself recently, is about the Gothic and what perhaps the Gothic means to you as a sort of literary genre. I mean, obviously, it kind of comes with all its sort of implied aesthetic trappings, but I think for fans of Gothic literature and Gothic art, it is something a lot deeper and sort of more profound than cobwebs and heaving virgin bosoms. Maybe not. I don't know. So yeah, what was kind of engaging with the Gothic something you were conscious of when you were writing the stories? What does the Gothic mean to you?
Yeah, strangely, I don't remember being super conscious of it while I was writing, which is unusual for me because I'm such a, I was a literature student. I'm such a nerd basically when it comes to sort of all of the different traditions and sort of, like you say, the aesthetic elements. There were some of the stories more than others, like you say, The White Lion. I was very conscious of it's this kind of carnivalesque Victorian, like in that sense, I was kind of indulging a bit in all of the like, like the aesthetic traditions as well as the kind of deeper meanings of the Gothic. So that one was more deliberate, I think. But yeah, it was only kind of when people started to read the book, and that word kept cropping up again and again. And I was like, well, that makes sense.
Mhm.
It sort of picked up something about my writing and my interests that I almost hadn't deliberately weaved in there. Um, but I'm sort of I've always been very interested in the Gothic. I was a huge Jane Eyre fan when I was younger and that sort of thing. And but I think for me, a bit like the whole book really is about kind of reclaiming this idea of monstrousness or this kind of this strangeness and almost finding a way to celebrate that and sort of turn it into something quite positive or quite strangely beautiful in a way. um and I think the Gothic plays into that really, really well because I think any kind of tradition that is based around horror or terror, and sort of it taps into these really deep feelings of, okay, what is it that we find frightening? What is it that we find strange or uncanny or disturbing? And why do we feel that way? And do we need to feel that way, really? So I think that makes it a great kind of playground for someone like me, and particularly talking about disability and things, which has its own huge kind of history in the Gothic, um, to to turn it on its head. And there's that great quote as well. It's a Harvard professor, I can't remember their name, but who says that art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable.
Yeah.
Which is something I always think about with my writing. And again, I think Gothic elements kind of play so well into that. I think it's definitely, as a reader, I know that it's a kind of genre that um that I think people sort of find something of themselves in, or something familiar, or find a way to understand themselves through that, even though, like you say, the superficial aesthetic of it is very sort of scandalous and frightening and all of these things.
Mhm.
Actually, there's quite a resonance there for some people. um so yeah, it's been very interesting to sort of think about this retrospectively and realize that so much of that went in without me noticing.
Yeah, it's interesting because for all of its kind of superficial flashiness, as you say, or perhaps superficial dustiness is a more appropriate way of putting it, kind of Gothic literature and Gothic art can be some of the most, like, in my opinion, profoundly humane art, kind of placing at the fore as it does the idea of sort of an identity that is deeper than the single and sort of non-friable body in the middle of the world. Um, I think so there's an epigraph um, to this collection, which is two different definitions of monstrum, which obviously is the title of the collection. One, a divine omen, supernatural appearance, wonder, miracle, or portent. Or two, an abnormal shape, unnatural growth, monster, monstrosity.
Mm.
And that dual meaning, obviously, you picked it as an epigraph, um, kind of illuminates, I suppose, the sort of equivocalities and double meanings that you are playing with in this collection.
Mm.
I wonder if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that was the sort of, like I said before, when I was kind of shaping this collection, I didn't know at first what it was going to be. I'd sort of written The Changeling, and I was thinking about how I could do kind of variations on a theme, or
Mm,
look at this from different angles. Um, and the kind of light bulb moment for me was, I was just reading an article, and it talks about this word monstrum,
mm,
and how the word monstrum in ancient Roman times referred to both a mythical monster and a person with a disability, which is obviously what's kind of gestured to in the epigraph there, which is taken from a real Latin dictionary.
yes.
um, because it's this sort of, yeah, this element of the supernatural or the monstrous, combined with these very real kind of different shapes of bodies, or like visible differences. Um, and yeah, and that just kind of fascinated me, this idea that, and obviously The Changeling had been similarly written after I'd been researching changeling myths at university, and I'd learned that they sort of come from people attempting to understand disability in young children, and children who were born different and sort of, didn't were sort of incongruous to the setting they were in. So sort of realizing for me that there's, again, talking about the Gothic, that almost these stories are really, and sort of elements of the supernatural in our myths and our folk tales, are really, really intertwined with trying to understand difference and trying to navigate our kind of fear of difference. And all of these very primal, I talk a lot in the book about, it was one of the words we had to kind of take out because I use the word primal a lot. Because it's this kind of, because I think that sticks around in people still now, this knee-jerk response they have to things that are strange or unknown to them or different. And it's, it comes from a very deep place, I think. And I think all through history and all through literature and mythology, we can see people grappling with those feelings, and with sort of what it evokes in them. It's this very big thing. But yeah, so for me, I wanted to include that there in the epigraph,
Mm,
because for me, that kind of encapsulated that whole intertwining of these two things, and was almost kind of like a justification for why I was mingling them in my stories in the way I did, in that, throughout history, monstrousness has been used as a framework to explore disability. And so I now am kind of trying to reclaim that and use it as my framework to explore it from my perspective rather than
Mm.
from this kind of othering outside perspective. Um, so yeah, so it was kind of important to me to get that in there in some format.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about sort of you've already mentioned Jane Eyre, but kind of your influences and I suppose kind of the lineage of the Gothic. Because I
Yeah.
feel like if you're a woman and you're writing Gothic fiction, someone who's going to come up is Angela Carter. And that's an influence that perhaps some of us would welcome naming and some of us would not.
I'm an
And
Angela Carter fan, I have to
me
say.
too.
I don't mind that comparison because I love her and was very much I'm still into her, but was very much into her while I was reading the book, so writing the book rather. So I think that, you know, I actually did one of my dissertations at university because I did two, but one of them was about Angela Carter.
Oh,
Um,
excellent.
so I think that's very much part of the kind of DNA of my writing, and I don't mind that comparison. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but I suppose I'm thinking about sort of instances where perhaps the Gothic or horror writing can veer into the exploitative,
Mm.
and how perhaps specifically from your experience as a disabled person, um, how you think not necessarily yourself, but other writers and other creators might go about walking that line. I know it was something I was very conscious of when I was writing my second novel, The Glutton, um, in presenting a character who most likely did historically have what we would now recognize to be some kind of disability, but being very careful to not medicalize him in terms of my retelling of the story. I didn't want it to be a novel trying to explain what was wrong with him.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
felt like part of the reason uh, he had become the historical figure he was that was the only sort of interest people had had in him.
mm.
Um, so yeah, I suppose I'm sort of interested in both your influences, but perhaps also any sort of Gothic bête noirs in that regard.
Yeah, that's really intriguing actually, because I think so in terms of my influences, like I say, obviously a
Mm,
lot of Angela Carter in there. I love Shirley Jackson
yeah.
as well. I mean, you know, talking about kind of the primal nature of the Gothic, I think sort of the haunted house, the original haunted house story, and the
Mm,
way she uses that to explore kind of human feelings is, you know, is a textbook example of that. Um, and a big one for me, strangely, is actually a lot more, it's more science fiction than
mm,
Gothic, really. It's when I was quite young, I read actually my mum gave me a copy of John Wyndham's The Chrysalids when I was about 9, which is not really the target audience for that book, but she just knew that that it would really resonate with me.
mm.
Um, and and it really did because it's this kind of, you know, it's I have a bit of a soft spot for that kind of 1950s era dystopia, so like John Wyndham, Ray Bradbury, that kind of thing.
Sort of
Because I
slightly
again,
pulpy.
yeah, yeah.
Mm,
But again, I think it's something that, I mean, first of all, particularly Ray Bradbury, amazing short story writer, the mechanics of his short stories are kind of so useful, I find, in, you know, constructing short, compelling narratives. But also, again, I think anything that's kind of looking at the popular imagination and sort of that slightly, almost sometimes quite exaggerated horror really taps into something quite deep about what people are frightened of, what people are feeling in a given sort of historical moment, and particularly the chrysalids, which is this kind of dystopia where they're exiling all of the children who have kind of birth defects from the nuclear fallout. Um, is just like I was just obsessed with it because it was it's a fascinating examination of those kinds of that kind of mentality. But then in terms of I find it very interesting what you say in terms of not wanting to tip into the more exploitative elements of the Gothic or kind of, I think it's difficult. I mean, like one of my main influences as well from when I was very young was I was obsessed with the original Grimm's fairy tales, which I think is a classic, like, you know, dark
mm.
and twisty child thing to be interested in. As soon as I discovered that there were like these secret horrible versions of the Disney stories I'd been watching, I was like,
Yes.
I need I'm so into that. Again, it goes hand in hand with the kind of Angela Carter thing, really. And but I think, and so that was a huge influence, and I love them. so much, and I'm so interested in them, and they're obviously very kind of gothic and in their own right in a way. Um, but also kind of within that, I think I noticed sometimes, particularly, I first started playing around with trying to write my own versions of fairy tales when I was still in school, when I was like 17. And the thing I noticed was difficult was not because disability often plays kind of like an allegorical role in these stories. And that is its function, is it if someone's blind, that signifies something. If someone, and obviously I was aware of that and trying to turn it on its head. But what surprised me was how easy it is sometimes to slip into using disability in that way, because that's the way it's used in so many stories throughout history, is as
Mm.
this kind of signifier, rather than as a real human experience. And that kind of surprised me and was challenging to me, the fact that even though it was a real human experience that I was going through, it was still sometimes tempting to tip into, well, this is a metaphor for this. And actually I had to sort of rein myself back from that and go, but I want to look at the person within that, and I want to challenge that. So it was an interesting thing to navigate. And yeah, and it's surprising, I think, how deep-seated some of those
Mm.
biases are, even when you've done so much thinking about how to unpack them.
Yeah, I think there's also something really interesting going on right now in terms of sort of Gothic retellings, not just in literature, but sort of taking on the ways in which race can be a source of othering. I'm kind of thinking about it because the second series came out today, but the new interview with the vampire, in which
Mm.
vampirism becomes not just sort of the metaphor for class and class exploitation that it always has been, but race and the experience of being an African American. And it pleases me that perhaps kind of this genre associated with sort of decadence and decay, which was perhaps thought to have had its heyday sometime around the 80s, is still being turned to such fruitful and interesting work.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that's something I particularly love about, I think it's sort of almost a common theme in a lot of the books that I love the most, that sometimes the concept can sound kind of outlandish or gimmicky, and then it is executed in such a nuanced way. Like I'm a huge Octavia Butler fan, and kind of Kindred is one of my favorite novels. And when you're like, well, she keeps getting taken back in time and everything, it sounds a very different book than the kind of book it is. And actually
mm,
it's this kind of like amazingly complex narrative of sort of like generational trauma and sort of all of these things. And I think that's when someone can pull that off really well, using taking something and using it as particularly something that comes with preconceptions, like you say, of this kind of like 80s whatever, and
mm.
then using it in this very very clever way. I love that. I think that there's something quite satisfying about that.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get round to Octavia Butler for the longest time because I know I would love her, but just never have one of those kind of blind spots in my reading.
Mm.
But I will now.
Yeah. Yeah, Kindred is a great one to start with. That's
Okay.
really beautiful.
Another question that is more just sort of for my personal nosiness, which I wanted to ask you is, what are you working on now? Are you working? I mean, obviously, right now you are probably working on promoting Monstrum, but are you finding time for more writing?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, I mean, I say working loosely. I would really like to. It's interesting because you were saying that you've never kind of attempted short stories and you would like to attempt them. I've never attempted anything longer form, and I would
Mhm.
like to make that my next challenge. I'm still writing short stories as well. So, like, I've got a short story coming out on Radio 4 on Friday the 17th, which is
Okay.
not one of the ones from Monstrum, but is very much in a similar vein of kind of gothic-y animal transformation, folk horror vibes. So I'm still doing short stories, but also, yeah, I'm looking now and I'm in the early stages of, yeah, trying to write a novel, which sort of spooks me slightly, but I'm up for it. I'm up for the challenge.
Brilliant. And it can be incredibly tiring, but I hope you enjoy it so much. And it's really just a thrilling book, and I hope it's thrilling for you to kind of be sharing it with all of us. Um,
Thank you
Great.
so
Thank you if you've been watching or listening to this Fane online event with the brilliant Lottie Mills, who I'm sure you are going to be sick of hearing about in a year's time, if this collection goes anything as well as I think it's going to. So thank you so much for chatting to me, Lottie. It's been really lovely to meet you and hear about your influences and hear about how you wrote these stories. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It's been
you.
so lovely to meet you.
Okay. Bye.